They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned the hard way that greed is thicker than blood. My name is Willow Backer. I was 58 years old, and I thought I knew my daughter better than anyone. I was wrong. What she did to me in front of my neighbors was terrible, but what I did back, that was a story for the ages. The morning of September 15th started like any other day in my perfect house. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the sun make my garden look gold and orange. I held a cup of special coffee that cost more than most people's weekly food shopping. At 58, I had learned to like nice things. Not because I was spoiled, but because I had earned every single one. I had spent many years making smart money choices and business plans. I had turned a small amount of money I was given into a $1.6 million estate in a very rich neighborhood. My reflection in the window showed a woman who had aged well. My hair was silver blonde, and it fell softly past my shoulders. My green eyes had caught the attention of 3 husbands, and I had outlived 2 of them. My face had a shape that made people think I used to be a model. I stayed in shape by doing yoga and Pilates every day. My skin glowed from using expensive creams and from the confidence of a woman who never doubted herself. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 a.m. The sound filled my house. I looked at the security screen and smiled. My daughter, Sarah, was in a police car in my driveway. The car was shiny black and white. Sarah was my pride and joy. She was 34 and a police sergeant who had worked very hard to get where she was. She was tall and strong, with my green eyes and her father's dark hair. People respected her everywhere she went. Next to her was her husband, Marcus. He was a man I never really liked, even though I tried for the sake of my family. I opened the door, feeling happy to see them. I still believed in the idea of a family that was always loyal. "Sweetheart, what a nice surprise," I said. I reached out to hug my daughter, but something about how she was standing made me stop. She stood stiff and straight, with her hand on her belt in a way that seemed more like a police officer than a daughter. "Hello, Mother," she said. Her voice was cold, and it sent a first shiver of unease down my back. "We need to talk." "Of course, dear. Come in. I'll make some coffee." Actually, Marcus cut in, his voice louder than it needed to be. "We think it's better if we talk out here, where people can see." I looked around, and for the first time, I saw that some of my neighbors had come out of their houses. Mrs. Peterson was watering plants that clearly didn't need water. The Johnsons were very busy checking their mailbox. Even old Mr. Chun had found some urgent yard work to do. "I don't understand," I said, but a terrible feeling was starting to grow in my mind. "Mother," Sarah said, using the same tone she used for people she was arresting, "we're worried about your mind. You've been making some bad decisions lately." "Bad decisions?" I asked, truly confused. "What are you talking about?" Marcus stepped forward. He was big, and his presence was scary. At 6 feet 2 inches, and with a body like a football player, he always used his size to make people feel scared. Today was no different. The spending, Willow, the crazy phone calls, the way you've been acting strangely and losing control, he said. His voice was loud enough for every neighbor to hear. "We can't just stand by and watch you ruin yourself." "I haven't been—" "Yes, you have," Sarah said, cutting me off. Her hand went to her handcuffs. "And as a police officer, I have a duty to protect people who can't protect themselves, even when that person is my own mother." The sound of the handcuffs clicking was loud in the morning air. I stared at the shiny metal in my daughter's hands, my mind struggling to understand what was happening. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "For your own protection, Mother. You are clearly not able to make good decisions about your money or your safety. This is crazy." "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice now sounding like he was talking to a crazy person, "please turn around and put your hands behind your back." "I will not," I said, my words coming out sharper than I had planned. I saw my neighbors lean in closer, wanting to hear every word. That's when Marcus made his first mistake. His first bad move, in what I would later understand was a carefully planned show. He grabbed my arm roughly, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave bruises. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The push came without warning. His hands slammed into my shoulders, sending me falling backward toward my front door. I caught myself against the doorframe. My silk shirt was torn at the shoulder. My pride was completely broken in front of people I had known for years. "She's having an episode," he shouted for our audience. "She's been threatening people, making crazy claims, spending money on silly things." The handcuffs clicked around my wrists with a sound that would stay in my mind for months. The metal was cold against my skin, a physical sign of the betrayal that was slowly sinking into me. "This is for your own good," Sarah said, but she wouldn't look at me. "We've already talked to a lawyer about having you declared not able to manage your life. The paperwork is ready." Paperwork. Marcus took a folder from his car. It was thick with legal documents that were clearly prepared ahead of time. Asset protection forms. "We'll manage your money until you're better." I looked at the papers through my shock and shame. There were documents to transfer my property, papers giving them power over my life, and a request for guardianship that said I was a confused woman who had lost touch with reality. "All you have to do is sign," Sarah said, her voice softer now, almost begging. "We'll take care of everything. The house, the investments, all of it. You won't have to worry about making any more bad decisions." The neighbors were pretending not to look, but I could feel their eyes on me. Mrs. Peterson's watering can was just hanging in her hand. The Johnsons stood frozen by their mailbox. Mr. Chen's rake was left on his lawn. I was being shamed in public, losing my dignity in front of people who had respected me for years. The perfect suburban woman was now a woman in handcuffs being lectured by her own child about her mental health. And in that moment, standing there with metal chains on my wrists and my torn shirt hanging off my shoulder, I made a decision that would change everything. I smiled, not the warm, motherly smile I had been giving my daughter for 34 years, not the polite, social smile I used at parties and neighborhood barbecues. This was something else entirely, a smile that came from a place deep inside me that I had never used before. A place where patience and anger lived together, where smart thinking mixed with a strong desire to get even, where a woman who had been underestimated her whole life finally decided to show the world what she was truly capable of. "All right," I said, my voice steady and calm despite the handcuffs, the audience, and the complete end of my peaceful morning. "I'll sign." Sarah's relief was clear, but Marcus looked suspicious. He had expected more of a fight, more drama, more of the strange behavior they had been telling the neighbors about. "Just like that?" he asked. "Just like that," I said. I looked him straight in the eyes, letting him see something that made him take a step back without wanting to. "After all, family is everything. Isn't that what you always say?" The papers were signed on my own front porch. My signature was shaky because of the handcuffs, but it was legally binding. With each stroke of the pen, I signed away my beautiful home, my money, my entire life, as I had known it. But I also signed something else into being, a plan that was already forming in my mind, as detailed and beautiful as the garden they were stealing from me. "There," I said, handing back the papers. "Is that everything?" "That's everything," Marcus said, unable to hide how happy he was. Sarah unlocked the handcuffs, and I rubbed my wrists where the metal had left red marks. "I suppose I should pack some things." "We'll help you," Sarah said, finally looking at me. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of guilt, a shadow of the daughter who used to curl up in my lap during storms. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold efficiency of a woman who had just stolen her mother's life and was in a hurry to make it official. As we walked into my house, my former house, I saw myself in the hallway mirror. My hair was messy, my shirt torn, my makeup smeared. I looked like a victim, but behind my eyes, something else was waking up. Something patient, calculating, and absolutely without mercy. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully shamed and ruined me, taken everything I had worked for, and made me a helpless woman who depended on their kindness. They had no idea they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The apartment they had arranged for me was designed to be humiliating. It was a small one-bedroom place in an old building with thin walls, creaky floors, and a view of the trash cans behind a pizza place. The rent was exactly one-fourth of what my property taxes used to be, which I guess they thought was funny. I stood in the middle of the empty living room, surrounded by the 3 suitcases that held all the things they let me keep, and I let the full weight of my situation sink in. No big closets, no garden where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the world wake up. Just a small space with plain walls and bright lights that made me look pale and dead in the bathroom mirror. "It's temporary," Sarah had said as she helped me carry my bags upstairs. Her voice was empty with a kind of guilt that was not strong enough to make her change her mind, but was certainly strong enough to make her feel bad. "Just until you're feeling better." Marcus had been less kind. "Honestly, Willow, this is probably better for you anyway. The big house was just too much to take care of, too much temptation to make bad money decisions." I nodded and smiled and thanked them for their concern. I played the part of the thankful, confused woman who was happy to have her loving family taking care of her. Inside, I was remembering every word, every look, every sign that showed their true reasons. They wanted me to be thankful. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to quietly disappear into this little box they had built for me, to fade away like a shameful family secret, while they enjoyed the rewards of their theft. Instead, I spent my first week in my new place doing what I had always done best: research. The public library became my new home. Its internet connection was my window into the digital paper trail that would either prove my daughter and her husband were bad people or prove them innocent. I sat at a corner table for hours each day, my silver hair tied back in a simple ponytail, reading glasses on my nose, looking for all the world like a harmless older woman catching up on her emails. The picture that came out was more damning than I had dared to hope. Marcus Chun. I had never bothered to look into my son-in-law's past before the wedding, trusting Sarah's judgment like the naive mother I had been. His past read like a criminal history book. 3 past business ventures, all failed under suspicious reasons. A history of relationships with older women that had ended with strange money transfers. A bankruptcy filing that had been thrown out because of small details that seemed too easy to be a coincidence. And most interesting of all, a sealed record from when he was a young person that had been erased, but left just enough digital footprints for someone who knew where to look. Sarah's record was more complex, but just as troubling. 5 complaints of using too much force in the past 2 years, all dismissed because of a lack of clear proof. A pattern of visiting elderly citizens for wellness checks that often ended with them being taken into protective care and their money being frozen. A reputation among lawyers as someone who bent rules just enough to not get caught. My daughter, I realized with a mix of pride and horror, had been running long-term scams on vulnerable older people for years. Marcus wasn't her husband. He was her business partner, and I had been their biggest prize yet. By the end of my second week in the apartment, I had put together a file that would have made a government lawyer cry with joy. Bank records, property transfers, witness statements, digital messages. Everything I needed to prove that my protection had been a carefully planned fraud. But proving it and using it were 2 different things. I sat at my tiny kitchen table on a Wednesday evening. The legal documents were spread before me like cards, showing a future that had to happen. I realized I had a choice to make. I could take everything I had found to the police right away. File complaints, press charges, demand justice through official ways. It would be the expected response of a victim seeking justice through proper legal means. Or I could do something else entirely. I poured myself a glass of wine, a cheap one that was all my new budget allowed, and thought about my options. Outside my window, the neon sign from the pizza place cast red and blue shadows across my wall. A disco of sadness that perfectly matched my surroundings. The official path would take months, maybe years. There would be investigations, hearings, appeals. Sarah would claim she had acted in my best interests. Marcus would hire expensive lawyers and disappear behind legal details. Even if I won, the victory would feel empty, cold, unsatisfying. The other path would take longer, but would be so much more rewarding. I thought about the handcuffs, cold and humiliating on my wrists, I thought about Marcus's hands pushing me backward, the planned violence of someone who had done this before. I thought about the neighbors watching, their faces a mix of shock and secret happiness at seeing the perfect Willow backer brought low. Most of all, I thought about Sarah's voice as she had clicked those handcuffs into place. "This is for your own good, Mother." No, the official path was for official people dealing with official problems. What Sarah and Marcus had done to me was personal. It deserved a personal response. I opened my laptop and began making lists. The first list had every person who had seen my public humiliation. Neighbors, delivery drivers, random runners who happened to be passing by, people who would remember seeing a respected woman dragged away in handcuffs by her own daughter. The second list had every professional contact I had made over 40 years of business dealings. Lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, bankers, people who knew my reputation and would be shocked to learn about my supposed mental problems. The third list had every piece of information I had found about Sarah and Marcus's other activities. Names, dates, amounts, locations. The building blocks of a case that would destroy not just their current scheme, but their entire criminal business. But the fourth list was the most important one. It had the names of people who owed me favors. Big favors. The kind of debts that built up over decades of thoughtful kindness, well-timed business referrals, and the occasional secret help with money during someone else's moment of crisis. Judge Patricia Holloway, whose daughter's drug charges had quietly disappeared after I had connected her with the right rehabilitation program. Lawyer Michael Brennan, whose real estate business had started with a loan I gave him when no bank would touch his credit. Detective Rachel Martinez, whose wrongful termination lawsuit had been solved in her favor after I had given good character references and connected her with the right legal representation. Journalist Diana Foster, whose award-winning investigation into city corruption had been made possible by financial documents I had gotten through my business connections. People who understood the concept of helping someone who helped you. People who had both the power and the reason to help me turn my carefully gathered evidence into something that looked like justice. Over the next week, I began making phone calls. Not the desperate calls of a woman asking for help, but the careful, calm conversations of someone calling in markers that had been collecting interest for years. "Patricia, it's Willow Backer. I hope you're well. I was wondering if you might have time for lunch next week. I have something I'd like to discuss with you. Something that might be of interest to your sense of justice. Michael, Willow Backer. I know it's been too long. Listen, I've come across a rather interesting legal situation, a case that might appeal to your special expertise in getting money back. Rachel, dear, how are you? I was just thinking about our conversation last year about patterns of elder abuse within law enforcement. I may have stumbled across something that would interest you. Diana, it's Willow. Remember that story you mentioned about wanting to look into corruption in suburban police departments? Well, I might have exactly what you're looking for. Each conversation was short, casual, the kind of chat old friends might have over coffee. But under the pleasant talk, I was weaving the threads of a web that would eventually trap my daughter and her husband in ways they could not imagine. By the end of my third week in my new place, the pieces were starting to move. Judge Holloway had agreed to look at my evidence in private and had said she was shocked at what looked like a clear case of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Lawyer Brennan had taken on my case for free and was already filing initial motions that would make life very uncomfortable for Sarah and Marcus. Detective Martinez had opened an unofficial inquiry into patterns of suspicious wellness checks and protective custody cases involving elderly people, and journalist Diana Foster had begun researching a story about corruption in suburban police departments with a special focus on a certain sergeant who seemed to have unusual success in protecting senior citizens from their own financial decisions. But the most important conversation had been with someone whose name wasn't on any of my lists. Dr. Emily Rhodes, a doctor of the mind whose expert opinion could destroy the entire foundation of Sarah and Marcus's case against me. "Willow," she had said after looking at the documents of my mental incompetence, "I've seen healthier psychological profiles from people in active psychosis. whoever evaluated you for this guardianship request was either terribly bad at their job or deliberately lying. Which do you think it was? Given the money involved, I had said, I'd say deliberate lying. And that, my dear, is a serious crime. I hung up the phone and poured myself another glass of wine. This one was a slightly better kind that I had allowed myself to celebrate the progress. Outside my window, the pizza sign flickered and hummed, casting its red and blue shadows across my legal documents. Sarah and Marcus thought they had won. They thought they had successfully isolated me, taken away my resources and credibility, made me a sad figure dependent on their charity. They had no idea that every day they delayed in checking on their supposedly incompetent victim was another day I spent building the case that would destroy them. Some battles are won with immediate, overwhelming force. Others are won with patience, preparation, and the absolute certainty that justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice made perfect. I raised my glass to the neon glow outside my window and smiled the same smile I had given them on my front porch 3 weeks earlier. They taught me something valuable about the nature of family loyalty. Now, I was going to teach them something about the consequences of underestimating the wrong woman. The law office of Brennan and Associates took up the top 3 floors of a shiny downtown skyscraper. Its marble lobby and crystal lights told anyone who entered that justice here came at high prices. I sat in Michael Brennan's corner office, surrounded by windows that offered a wide view of the city, and felt a familiar sense of happiness at being back in my natural environment. "Willow," Michael said, sitting down behind a desk that probably cost more than most people's cars. "I have to admit, when you called me 3 weeks ago, I was expecting something far less detailed." He gestured to the files spread across his conference table. 3 boxes worth of documents, photos, bank records, and recorded phone calls that painted a picture of a planned crime that went far beyond simple family theft. "You've built a major crime case against your own daughter." "I've built a case for justice," I corrected, though I could not deny the pride in my voice. What they did to me wasn't a single event. It was part of a pattern that's been going on for years. Michael picked up one of the files, a collection of Sarah's wellness checks over the past 18 months. 12 elderly citizens, all living alone, all targeted after family members or neighbors had said they were worried about their money decisions. All of them had been placed under protective guardianship arrangements that had resulted in their money being managed by court-appointed people. These people, by coincidence, had all used the same mental health expert to check their mental ability. The same expert who had declared me incompetent based on a 15-minute phone call and a review of financial records that had been carefully edited to remove any signs of good decision-making. "Dr. Russell Camden," I said, seeing where Michael's attention had focused. Licensed psychiatrist, certified expert, and apparently a man with a very flexible relationship with professional rules. His evaluations are perfect examples of him looking for what he already believes. Michael agreed, flipping through the psychiatric reports. Every single assessment reaches the same conclusion, no matter the patient's real mental state, because he's not actually evaluating mental ability. He's providing a legal excuse for theft. The pattern was very simple once you understood it. Sarah would find vulnerable targets, usually wealthy elderly citizens with few family connections or people watching over them. She'd arrange for worried calls to be made about their behavior, often using Marcus's charm to make friends with neighbors or service providers who could give believable witness statements. Then came the wellness checks, the emergency protective custody, the quick competency hearings with outcomes that were already decided. The victims would find themselves stripped of legal authority over their own lives, their money transferred to people who charged huge fees for the privilege of managing wealth that was systematically reduced through necessary expenses and management costs. By the time the victims realized what was happening, they were legally powerless to stop it. And if they tried to fight back, their protests were simply more proof of their mental instability. "How many people do you think they've done this to?" Michael asked. "Based on what I can prove, at least 30 over the past 5 years. Based on what I suspect," I shrugged, "probably twice that number. We're talking about millions of dollars. We're talking about lives ruined." I said, my voice harder than I had planned. People like Mrs. Eleanor Carrington, 83 years old, a former math professor, who supposedly became incompetent the week after she decided to change her, well, to leave her estate to her grandchildren instead of her estranged son. The son, who just happened to be dating a police officer named Sarah Chun. The very same Mrs. Carrington died in state care 6 months later, alone and confused, while her estate was systematically liquidated to pay for her protection. Michael was quiet for a long moment, looking at the photograph of Mrs. Carrington that I had included in the file, a dignified woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes taken just months before Sarah had destroyed her life. You know, he said finally, most people would have just filed a complaint with Internal Affairs and hoped for the best. Most people aren't me. No, they certainly aren't. He leaned back in his chair, a hungry smile crossing his face. So, what exactly do you want me to do with all this? I want you to file a civil lawsuit that will take away every single thing they've accumulated through this scheme. I want criminal charges that will put them both in prison for the rest of their lives. And I want it done in a way that makes sure every victim they've targeted knows they have legal help. That's a tall order. You owe me a tall favor. Michael's smile grew wider. Yes, I do, and I always pay my debts. He stood and walked to his window, hands behind his back, looking out over the city like a general looking at a battlefield. The civil case will be simple, he said. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit fraud. With the evidence you've gathered, we can probably get triple the damages plus lawyer fees. And the criminal case, that's more difficult. We need the district attorney to take it seriously. And DAs are famously not willing to prosecute police officers. Even corrupt ones. Especially corrupt ones. Bad cops make DAs look bad. And looking bad is career suicide in politics. I joined him at the window, watching traffic flow through the streets below like blood through veins. Somewhere down there, Sarah was probably finishing her shift, sure that her mother was safely contained in a small apartment, too broken and shamed to cause any trouble. What if the case came to the DA's attention through unofficial channels? I asked, you mean if someone leaked your evidence to the media first, created enough public outrage that the DA had no choice but to investigate? I mean, if someone happened to provide that evidence to an award-winning journalist who specialized in exposing city corruption. Michael's reflection in the window grinned back at me. That someone wouldn't happen to be Diana Foster, would it? Diana's always been very interested in stories about law enforcement overreach, and you've always been very good at providing information to interested journalists. I've always believed in the public's right to know. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city live below us. I thought about all the people who were currently going about their daily lives, not knowing that their lives could be destroyed by a daughter's handcuffs and a fake mental health check. People like I had been just a month ago. There's one more thing, I said. I want to personally attend every hearing, every deposition, every moment of their legal destruction. I want them to see my face when their world comes crashing down. That's unusually vengeful for you, Willow. No, I said, thinking about the cold metal of handcuffs on my wrists, about Marcus's hands pushing me backward, about the neighbors watching my humiliation with secret satisfaction. That's unusually honest for me. Michael returned to his desk and began organizing the files into neat stacks. I'll need a few weeks to prepare the initial filings. Civil complaint first. Then we'll coordinate with the criminal investigation. How long before they know what's coming? Legally, I have to serve them with papers before any court appearances. But practically, he grinned. They won't know what hit them until it's too late to stop it. I gathered my purse and stood to leave, feeling lighter than I had since the morning of my public humiliation. For the first time in a month, I had hope, not just for my own revenge, but for justice that went far beyond my personal problems. Michael, I said, pausing at his office door, when this is over, remind me to tell you about the time I helped a young lawyer get his first commercial real estate loan. I remember that time very well, Willow. It's why I'm taking this case. No, I said, looking him in the eyes. You're taking this case because Sarah and Marcus made one fatal mistake. What mistake was that? They assumed that because I'm their victim, I must be everyone's victim. They never considered the possibility that I might be someone else's biggest asset. I left his office with the satisfaction of knowing that the next part of my plan was in motion. The legal machine was beginning to turn, slowly and surely, like the gears of a clock that had been carefully wound and set to strike at exactly the right moment. But legal justice was only part of what I had in mind for my daughter and her husband. Some lessons could only be learned through public humiliation, and I was about to teach them both a master class in the subject. The Riverside Country Club had been my social safe place for 23 years. Its clean golf course and fancy dining room with a backdrop for countless business deals, charity events, and the kind of casual talks that shaped the political and economic landscape of our community. Now, as I walked through its familiar halls, wearing a simple black dress instead of my usual expensive clothes, I felt like an actress returning to a stage where she had once been the star, but was now playing a small part. The difference in how people treated me was small but clear. Conversations that would have naturally included me now took place just out of my hearing. Invitations that would have been automatic now required careful thought about whether being with me might hurt someone's reputation. I was, after all, the woman who had been publicly declared incompetent by her own daughter, the former socialite who had been handcuffed in her own driveway and forced to sign away her money to prevent further strange behavior. At least that was the story Sarah and Marcus had been carefully spreading through our social circles. What they didn't realize was that their whisper campaign was giving me the perfect chance to start one of my own. Willow, dear. Margaret Thornton came up to my table in the club's dining room. Her face was a careful mix of sympathy and curiosity. I was so sorry to hear about your situation. Margaret was the wife of our local congressman and the unofficial queen of the country club's social group. Her opinion carried weight, and her gossip reached the right ears very efficiently. Thank you, Margaret. It's been hard. I let my voice have just the right note of brave acceptance. But I'm learning to accept that sometimes family members make decisions they think are best, even when those decisions are based on incomplete information. Incomplete information? I looked around the dining room as if checking for people listening in, then leaned forward slightly. Well, I probably shouldn't say anything, but the mental health check that declared me incompetent was based entirely on a phone call. The doctor never actually met me in person. Margaret's eyes widened. That seems unusual. I thought so, too, especially since I'd been managing a multi-million-dollar investment portfolio successfully for decades. I shrugged with a look of resignation. But Sarah is a police officer, and her husband has experience with these matters. I suppose they know more about mental health assessments than I do. Her husband has experience with mental health assessments. Oh, yes, Marcus has been involved in several cases where elderly people needed protection. From their own poor judgment, he's quite knowledgeable about the process. I didn't mention that his knowledge came from running the same scam on many victims. That piece of information would come later, when Margaret and others were ready to hear it. How awful for you, though, Margaret said, her reporter-like instincts clearly sensing a story, to have your own family question your competence. The hardest part, I said, dabbing at my eyes with my napkin, is knowing that there are other families going through the same thing. Other elderly people who are being protected whether they need it or not. Other families? Well, I shouldn't name names, but I've heard that several other people in town have had similar experiences recently. Wellness checks that turned into custody situations, competency evaluations that seemed rushed, money that was transferred for protection purposes. Margaret was leaning forward now, her lunch forgotten. As the congressman's wife, she was always alert for potential scandals that might affect her husband's reputation or provide ammunition against his political opponents. That does sound concerning, she said carefully. I'm sure it's all perfectly legal. I said quickly, Sarah wouldn't be involved in anything improper, but it does make me wonder about the oversight mechanisms for these kinds of interventions. I left Margaret with just enough information to spark her curiosity without seeming like I was actively trying to damage Sarah's reputation. Over the next hour, I had similar conversations with 3 other influential women. Each time, I shared slightly different pieces of the puzzle while maintaining my role as the confused, vulnerable victim who was trying to understand what had happened to her. By the end of lunch, I was sure that Margaret and her friends would be discussing the concerning pattern of elderly people being declared incompetent under questionable circumstances. And because they were worried citizens rather than bitter victims, their observations would carry far more weight than any direct accusations I might make. The beauty of a well-executed whisper campaign was that it appeared to happen on its own from multiple sources, creating the impression of widespread concern rather than targeted character assassination. Over the next 2 weeks, I attended every social event I could manage on my reduced budget. Church coffee hours, library fundraisers, neighborhood association meetings. Anywhere I could have casual conversations with people who knew my reputation and would be shocked to learn about my supposed mental decline. At each event, I played my role perfectly, the dignified woman who was trying to accept her family's decision while privately struggling to understand how a 15-minute phone call could override decades of proven ability. I never directly criticized Sarah or Marcus. I never suggested that their reasons were anything other than genuine concern for my well-being. Instead, I simply shared my confusion about the process, my surprise at how quickly everything happened, and my concern that other families might be facing similar situations without proper oversight. The effect was exactly what I had hoped for. Within a week, I began hearing reports of conversations taking place in circles I wasn't part of, questions being raised about the competency evaluation process, concerns being expressed about potential conflicts of interest when family members benefited financially from guardianship arrangements. Dr. Russell Camden's name began appearing in these conversations, not as an accused party, but as someone whose professional practices might need closer examination. Questions were being asked about his relationship with local law enforcement, his evaluation methods, and the unusual consistency of his findings in cases involving police wellness checks. But the most satisfying development came during my 3rd week of social reconnaissance. I was attending a charity auction for the Children's Hospital when I overheard a conversation between Judge Patricia Holloway and District Attorney Catherine Morrison. They were standing near the silent auction tables, speaking in the low tones that suggested a serious professional discussion. "Pat, I keep hearing concerns about some of these quick competency cases," Catherine was saying. "Multiple sources are suggesting there might be procedural irregularities." "I've been thinking the same thing," Patricia replied. "The Camden evaluations, in particular, seem formulaic, almost like he's working from a template rather than conducting genuine assessments. And there's the timing issue. These cases are moving through the system at an unusual pace, especially considering the complexity of the legal and financial arrangements involved." Catherine, what would you say to the idea of a systematic review? Not targeting any specific cases, but looking at patterns and procedures to ensure we're adequately protecting everyone's rights. I'd say it's exactly what we should be doing. In fact, I was planning to suggest something similar to you. I moved away from their conversation before either woman noticed my proximity, but I was smiling as I continued my tour of the auction items. The seed I had planted through my social network was taking root in exactly the right soil. Judge Holloway and D.A. Morrison were not responding to gossip or unproven accusations. They were responding to a pattern of concerns from multiple respected sources, all pointing toward the same conclusion. The system designed to protect vulnerable elderly citizens might be systematically failing in its mission. That evening, I called Diana Foster. "Diana, dear, how's your investigation into city corruption progressing?" "Slowly but steadily. I'm finding some interesting patterns in the court records, but I need more concrete evidence of wrongdoing before I can publish anything definitive." "What kind of concrete evidence?" "Financial records showing improper money flows, documentation of procedural violations, testimony from victims who are willing to go on record." Hypothetically speaking, what if someone had compiled exactly that kind of evidence? Someone who had personal experience with the system, but also access to information about other cases. Hypothetically speaking, I'd be very interested in reviewing that evidence, especially if it came from a source with unquestionable credibility. And if that source happened to be someone who is currently a victim of the system, but had previously been a respected member of the community, that would be ideal. a victim with standing and resources who could provide both personal testimony and broader documentation of systemic abuse. Diana, I think we should have lunch tomorrow. The next day, we met at a small cafe downtown, far from the country club and the social circles where our conversation might be observed or reported. I brought 3 file folders, carefully selected evidence that would support Diana's investigation without revealing the full scope of what I had discovered. My God, Willow, she said after reviewing the first folder, this isn't just about your case. This is about dozens of cases. That's what I've been trying to tell people. But it's difficult when you're officially incompetent to manage your own affairs. These financial records show clear patterns of asset stripping, and the timeline on these competency evaluations, some of them were completed before the wellness checks were even conducted. Predetermination of outcomes does seem problematic from a legal standpoint. Diana was already taking notes, her reporter's instincts fully engaged. I'll need to verify these records independently, but if even half of this is accurate, we're looking at one of the largest elder abuse conspiracies in state history. Just remember, I said as we prepared to leave, I'm not the source of this information. I'm just a concerned citizen who happened to stumble across evidence of systemic problems while trying to understand what happened to me. Of course. But Willow, when this story breaks, you know what the retaliation is going to look like, don't you? I'm counting on it, I said with a smile that made Diana take a step backward. Because when someone retaliates against a victim, it confirms that the victim was on to something important. Over the next week, I watched the social landscape shift with the satisfaction of a chess master watching an opponent realize they had been maneuvered into an impossible position. The whisper campaign I had launched was now generating its own momentum, spreading through channels I couldn't directly control, but could certainly influence. Questions about Sarah and Marcus's activities were being raised by people who had no idea they were repeating information I had carefully placed into their conversations. More importantly, those questions were reaching the ears of people who had the power to do something about the answers. Judge Holloway had quietly begun reviewing all competency cases that had come through her court in the past 2 years. DA Morrison had assigned a senior prosecutor to conduct a preliminary investigation into procedural irregularities in elder protection cases, and Diana Foster was conducting the kind of deep investigative research that had made her career. Sarah and Marcus had no idea that the ground was shifting beneath them. They were still acting under the assumption that they had successfully isolated and neutralized their biggest threat. They were about to learn that isolating me had been their second biggest mistake. Their biggest mistake had been assuming that because they had taken away my house and my financial independence, they had also taken away my power. But power, I had learned over 40 years of business and social maneuvering, wasn't about what you owned. It was about who owed you favors, who trusted your judgment, and who would act on information you provided because they knew that information would be accurate, useful, and devastating to anyone who deserved to be destroyed. Sarah had inherited my green eyes and my determination, but she had never learned the most important lesson I could have taught her: never underestimate a woman who's spent decades building a network of allies, especially when that woman has just been given the ultimate motivation to use every connection she's ever made. The arrests came at dawn, exactly as Catherine Morrison had promised they would. I watched the coverage from my apartment, sipping coffee from my modest ceramic mug, while news helicopters circled overhead, and reporters described the dramatic early morning raids that had taken Sarah and Marcus into custody. The images were perfect in their irony. Sarah, still in her pajamas, being led away in handcuffs by her former colleagues. Marcus, messy and confused, stumbling as he was guided into the back of a police car. Both of them experiencing the same helpless humiliation they had inflicted on dozens of elderly victims. Sergeant Sarah Chun and her husband Marcus Chun were arrested this morning on multiple felony charges, the news anchor announced as footage rolled of my beautiful former home being taped off with crime scene tape. Authorities are conducting searches of their residence and business premises as part of an ongoing investigation into what prosecutors are calling one of the largest elder abuse conspiracies in state history. My phone rang before the news segment ended. Willow, it's Michael. Have you been watching? Every moment of it. Good, because we need to talk about the asset forfeiture proceedings. The government is moving to seize everything Sarah and Marcus acquired through their criminal enterprise, including your house. My house that they stole from me? Exactly. Which means we need to file an immediate motion to exclude your property from the forfeiture as belonging to a victim rather than a criminal. How long will that take? With the evidence we have, probably about 30 days. The government wants to return stolen assets to their rightful owners as quickly as possible. It makes their prosecution look more sympathetic to juries. 30 days. After 5 months of exile, I would have to wait just 30 more days to reclaim my home. But the financial destruction of Sarah and Marcus would begin immediately. Michael, what about their other assets? The investments, the cars, the luxury items they bought with stolen money? All of it will be seized. The government has already frozen their bank accounts and placed liens on their personal property. As of this morning, they have access to exactly nothing. What will they live on? Whatever their families can provide, assuming their families want to associate with accused criminals. Otherwise, they'll be depending on public defenders and whatever charity they can find. The irony was perfect. Sarah and Marcus had forced me into financial dependence, taking away my resources, and making me live on the small allowance they had decided I deserved. Now, they would experience that same helplessness, that same humiliation of having to beg for basic necessities while their former wealth was cataloged and redistributed to their victims. Over the next week, I followed their financial destruction with the attention of someone watching a particularly satisfying chess match reach its inevitable conclusion. The government's asset seizure was swift and complete. The BMW Marcus had been so proud of was repossessed and towed away while news cameras captured every moment. The expensive jewelry Sarah had accumulated was removed from their house by federal marshals and tagged as evidence. The vacation home they had purchased with stolen funds was seized and scheduled for auction. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. Marcus's former clients. Willow, Michael called me on Thursday morning, his voice full of satisfaction. You're going to love this. Marcus's construction company just lost every major contract they had because of the criminal charges, because of the morality clauses in their contracts. Apparently, when you're building luxury developments for wealthy clients, being arrested for stealing from elderly people is considered a significant breach of trust. How significant? $8 million in canceled contracts, plus penalty clauses for projects that will now have to be completed by other contractors. Marcus is looking at personal liability that will exceed anything they could possibly pay, even if they weren't already broke. The financial bloodletting was so thorough that I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Then I remembered the morning Sarah had handcuffed me in my own driveway, and my sympathy disappeared like morning mist. The criminal case moved forward with the unstoppable momentum of a system that had finally found defendants worth prosecuting. The grand jury returned indictments on 17 separate charges, including racketeering, elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. But the civil lawsuits were even more devastating. Willow, Michael announced during one of our weekly meetings, we now have 43 plaintiffs in our class action suit. 43 victims with documented losses totaling over $12 million. $12 million. And that's just what we can prove. The actual amount is probably much higher, but some victims died before we could document their cases, and others are too ashamed to come forward. What kind of settlement are we looking at? Settlement? Willow, we're not settling. We're going to trial, and we're going to win every penny we can extract from these people, plus punitive damages that will ensure they never financially recover from what they've done. Even if they don't have the money to pay, they'll get jobs, minimum wage jobs, probably since their professional reputations are destroyed. And for the rest of their lives, every paycheck they earn will be garnished to pay restitution to their victims. The prospect of Sarah and Marcus working minimum wage jobs while their paychecks were taken to pay back the people they had robbed was almost too perfect to believe. 2 weeks after their arrest, I received an unexpected phone call. Mrs. Backer, this is Linda Chun, Marcus's mother. I was wondering if I could speak with you. I paused, considering whether I wanted to engage with Marcus's family. In the end, curiosity won. Of course, Mrs. Chun. What can I do for you? I wanted to apologize for what my son did to you, for the pain he's caused your family, for the shame he's brought on all of us. That's very kind of you to say, Mrs. Backer. I need you to know that Marcus wasn't raised to behave this way. His father and I taught him to respect his elders, to work hard for what he wanted, to treat people with dignity and kindness. I'm sure you did your best, Mrs. Chun. We did, but somewhere along the way, he lost his moral compass. The gambling, the debts, the desperation, it changed him into someone we didn't recognize. Mrs. Chun, are you asking me to show mercy during sentencing? I'm asking you to remember that he has a family who loves him, parents who are ashamed of what he's done, but who still hope he can somehow make amends for his crimes. I sat in silence for a moment, thinking about the pain in this woman's voice. She was suffering for her son's choices, just as I had suffered for my daughter's choices. Mrs. Chun, I appreciate your call, and I'm sorry for the pain your family is experiencing, but I want you to understand something. Marcus didn't just steal money from me. He stole my dignity, my independence, my sense of safety in my own home. He handcuffed me like a criminal and forced me to sign away my life's work. I know, and there's no excuse for that. You're right. There isn't. And that's why he's going to face the full consequences of his choices. Not because I'm vengeful, but because what he did was unforgivable. I understand, Mrs. Chun. I hope your son learns from this experience. I hope he becomes the man you raised him to be. But that learning needs to happen in prison, surrounded by the consequences of his choices, not through the mercy of his victims. After I hung up, I sat in my small apartment and thought about the ripple effects of Sarah and Marcus's crimes. Their actions hadn't just destroyed their victims. They had devastated their own families, ruined their own futures, and created pain that would last for generations. But that was what happened when you built your life on other people's suffering. Eventually, the foundation crumbled, and everything you'd built came crashing down. My phone rang again. This time it was Sarah. Mother, please, I'm begging you. We'll plead guilty to everything. We'll accept whatever prison sentence they offer. But please don't testify at the sentencing hearing. Why not? Because every word you say will add years to our sentences. The judge will see you as the sympathetic victim, and she'll want to punish us as severely as possible. Sarah, you're going to be punished severely. That's the point of a criminal justice system. But it doesn't have to be as severe as possible. You could ask for mercy. You could talk about redemption and second chances. You could help us get shorter sentences. And why would I do that? Because I'm your daughter. Because you loved me once. Because somewhere inside you, there has to be some part that wants to see me have a chance at rebuilding my life. I paused, thinking about my response carefully. This was the moment I had been building toward. The opportunity to let Sarah understand exactly what she had cost herself when she had chosen greed over love. Sarah, do you remember when you were 12 years old and you wanted to go to summer camp? You remember the expensive camp that all your friends were attending? We couldn't afford it that year because your father had just lost his job, but you begged me to find a way. I remember. Do you remember what I told you? You said that if something was really important to me, we'd find a way to make it work. And do you remember what I did? You took a second job. I cleaned offices at night so you could earn the money for camp. I worked 16-hour days for 3 months so my daughter could have something that mattered to her, because that's what mothers do for their children. They sacrifice for them. They protect them. They put their children's needs ahead of their own comfort. Now, I want you to tell me, Sarah, when you needed money, when you were in financial trouble, when you were facing serious consequences for Marcus's debts, did you come to me and ask for help? Silence. Did you explain your situation and ask if there was a way for family to help family? We thought. You thought it would be easier to steal from me than to ask me for help. You thought I was old and vulnerable and wouldn't be able to fight back. You thought you could take what you wanted and I would just accept it. We were desperate. I was desperate when I worked 16-hour days to send you to summer camp. But I didn't steal from someone else to solve my problem. I made sacrifices, and I found honest solutions. This is different. You're right. This is different because when I needed to help my child, I worked harder. When you needed money, you committed crimes. That's the difference between us. Sarah, that's why I'm standing on courthouse steps talking to reporters, and you're hiding in shame waiting for your arrest. I hung up before she could respond, then sat in my small bedroom, surrounded by the modest furnishings of my temporary exile, and felt the deep satisfaction of a lesson finally taught. The day of Sarah and Marcus's sentencing arrived with the kind of clear, autumn light that made everything seem possible. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit, professional, dignified, and expensive enough to remind everyone in the courtroom that I was a woman of substance who had been systematically victimized by people who should have protected me. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victim families, and people who were just curious who had been following the case through months of media coverage. Sarah and Marcus sat at the defendant's table with their court-appointed attorneys. Both of them looked like shadows of their former selves. Sarah had lost weight during her months in jail waiting for trial. Her once proud posture was replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who had learned what it felt like to be powerless. Marcus looked older, grayer, defeated in a way that suggested he had finally understood the full scope of what his choices had cost him. Judge Patricia Holloway presided with the kind of strict authority that came from decades of seeing humanity at its worst and still believing in the possibility of justice. Before we proceed to sentencing, Judge Holloway announced the court will hear victim impact statements. I understand we have several people who wish to address the court today. I was the first to speak. I walked to the podium with measured steps, my statement carefully prepared, but my emotions entirely genuine. The courtroom fell silent as I arranged my papers and looked directly at Sarah and Marcus. Your Honor, my name is Willow Backer, and I am here to tell you about the morning my daughter destroyed my life. For the next 15 minutes, I described that September morning when Sarah had handcuffed me in my own driveway, the months of exile that had followed, and the systematic theft of everything I had worked 40 years to accumulate. But I also talked about something more fundamental, the betrayal of trust that occurred when someone who was supposed to love and protect you instead chose to exploit and victimize you. Your Honor, Sarah Chun didn't just steal my money. She stole my faith in family, my sense of security in my own home, and my belief that the people who claimed to love me would protect me from harm rather than cause it. I turned to look directly at Sarah, who was crying silently at the defendant's table. Sarah, you told me that what you were doing was for my own good. Today, I want you to understand that what I am doing is for your own good, because the only way you will ever become the person you were raised to be is if you face the full consequences of the person you chose to become. I returned to my seat, knowing that I had said everything that needed to be said. 5 other victims followed me to the podium, each telling their own story of betrayal and loss. Mrs. Eleanor Carrington's son spoke about watching his mother die alone and confused in state custody while her money was liquidated. Mr. Robert Martinez's daughter described the depression and despair that had consumed her father after he'd been declared incompetent and separated from his lifelong home. By the time the victim statements were complete, several people in the courtroom were crying, and Sarah and Marcus looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Judge Holloway reviewed the sentencing rules with clinical precision, weighing the severity of the crimes against the defendants' lack of a prior criminal history and their expressions of remorse. The court finds that the defendants engaged in a systematic pattern of criminal behavior that targeted some of our community's most vulnerable citizens, she announced. These crimes were not impulsive acts of desperation, but calculated decisions to exploit trust and abuse authority for personal financial gain. She turned to address Sarah directly. Sergeant Chun, you took an oath to protect and serve the citizens of this community. Instead, you used your badge and your authority to target elderly citizens for financial exploitation. You violated not only the law, but the fundamental trust that makes civil society possible. Mr. Marcus Chun, you served as the operational coordinator of this criminal enterprise, using your charm and apparent respectability to gain access to victims and execute the fraudulent schemes that your wife's position made possible. Judge Holloway paused, consulting her notes one final time. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that Sarah Chun be sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Marcus Chun will be sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. 22 years for Sarah, 18 for Marcus. Sentences that would effectively end their productive adult lives and ensure they would emerge from prison as elderly people themselves. Additionally, Judge Holloway continued, the defendants are jointly and severally liable for restitution in the amount of $12.4 million to their identified victims, plus attorney fees and court costs. $12 million they would never be able to pay on salaries they would never be able to earn for crimes they would spend the rest of their lives regretting. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, Sarah crying openly now, Marcus staring straight ahead with the empty expression of someone whose spirit had been completely broken, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice had been served with the kind of thoroughness that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider victimizing vulnerable seniors. Sadness because the daughter I had raised, the little girl who had once trusted me to protect her from the world's cruelties, had become someone who needed to be protected from herself. After the sentencing, I stood on the courthouse steps with Catherine Morrison, answering questions from reporters who wanted to know how it felt to see my own daughter sentenced to decades in prison. It feels like the end of a very long and difficult chapter, I said. Sarah and Marcus made choices that hurt dozens of families. Today, they learned that choices have consequences, even when those choices are made by people you love. Do you feel any regret about your role in their prosecution? I feel regret that it was necessary. I feel regret that my daughter chose crime over honesty, theft over asking for help, exploitation over compassion, but I feel no regret about ensuring that their victims received justice. What's next for you, Mrs. Backer? Next, I'm going home to my real home, the one I should never have been forced to leave. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. That evening, I received a call from Michael Brennan. Willow, I have news. The asset forfeiture proceedings are complete, and all the seized properties are being returned to their rightful owners, including your house. My house that they stole from me? Especially your house. You can move back in whenever you're ready. What about the other victims? Everyone who can be identified is getting their stolen assets returned. The people who died before we could resolve their cases, their estates will receive the restitution. It's not perfect justice, but it's as close as the legal system can provide. I hung up and walked to my small window, looking out at the city lights that had become familiar during my months of exile. Tomorrow I would leave this cramped apartment behind and return to the home that had been stolen from me. But I wouldn't be the same woman who had left that house in handcuffs 6 months ago. I had learned things about myself, about justice, and about the price of underestimating the wrong person. My phone rang one final time that evening. Mother! Sarah's voice was small, broken, calling from the jail, where she would spend her last night before being transported to federal prison. Yes, Sarah. I want you to know that I'm sorry for all of it, for what I did to you, for what I did to all those people, for the person I became. I know you are, dear. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me? I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness was a complex thing, especially when it involves someone who had systematically betrayed every bond of trust and love. Sarah, I forgive the little girl who made mistakes and learned from them. I forgive the teenager who sometimes chose poorly but accepted the consequences. I even forgive the young woman who struggled with difficult decisions and occasionally needed guidance. And the woman who handcuffed her mother, that woman will spend the next 22 years learning who she wants to be when she grows up. When she figures that out, we can discuss forgiveness. Will you visit me? Sarah, you took away my home, my independence, my dignity, and my sense of safety in the world. You'll serve your sentence, and you'll think about what you've done, and maybe someday you'll become someone worthy of a mother's love again. But that day is not today, and it won't be tomorrow. I understand. I hope you do. And Sarah, when you get out of prison, if you've learned what you needed to learn, we can talk about rebuilding our relationship. But it will be a new relationship built on honesty and respect, not the old one built on assumptions about family loyalty that you've proven don't apply to you. I hung up and poured myself a glass of wine. a good vintage, the kind I'd be able to afford again now that my money was being returned. Outside my window, the city lights twinkled like stars in a promise of possibility. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of a new chapter, one where I reclaimed not just my house, but my faith in the idea that justice was possible even when it took patience and planning and the kind of strategic thinking that turned apparent defeat into ultimate victory. Some stories, I reflected as I raised my glass to the night sky, had endings that were more satisfying than any beginning could promise. This was one of those stories. And the most satisfying part was knowing that Sarah and Marcus would spend the next 2 decades thinking about how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered by a woman they had thought was too old and powerless to fight back. Some lessons could only be learned through total defeat, and I had been an excellent teacher. Moving day arrived with the kind of golden October sunshine that made everything look like a promise fulfilled. I stood in the driveway of my reclaimed home, watching professional movers carry my modest belongings past the crime scene tape that had finally been removed, past the perfectly manicured gardens that had somehow survived 6 months of neglect, past the memories of handcuffs and humiliation that would forever mark this threshold. But I wasn't the same woman who had been forced to leave this house in defeat. The woman returning was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who might mistake her grace for weakness. Mrs. Backer, the moving supervisor, approached with a clipboard and the kind of respectful difference that came from knowing he was working for someone who had become moderately famous for destroying her own daughter's criminal career. "Where would you like us to put the new furniture?" I smiled at the phrase, new furniture. While my legal money had been frozen during the investigation, Michael Brennan had arranged for me to receive advanced payments from the civil lawsuit settlements. The money that Sarah and Marcus had stolen from other victims was being used to purchase the luxuries they had cost me. It was poetic justice at its finest. The master bedroom suite goes upstairs, the new living room furniture in the front parlor, and the dining room set where you'd expect it to go. I told him. And please be careful with the crystal. It's Waterford, and it's irreplaceable. Because if I was reclaiming my throne, I was going to do it with style. Over the next week, I made my recovered house into something that was even better than its former glory. Professional designers working with an unlimited budget provided by civil settlement money created interiors that whispered wealth and power in every detail. The new security system included cameras, motion sensors, and direct connections to both the police department and a private security firm. Never again would anyone approach my front door with malicious intent without being watched and recorded. The new safe room, hidden behind a bookshelf in my study, contained copies of every document related to my legal victory, along with enough cash and supplies to survive any future attempts at harassment or intimidation. And the new office, equipped with multiple computers and communication systems, would serve as the headquarters for my new mission in life, ensuring that no other elderly person would ever experience what Sarah and Marcus had done to me. "Willow, Michael called me on Friday afternoon. I have some final numbers on the settlement distributions. Please tell me they're substantial. 43 victims are receiving full restitution, totaling $12.4 million. Your personal settlement, including damages for emotional distress and loss of dignity, comes to $3.2 million, $3 million more than I'd had before Sarah and Marcus had stolen from me. Their crime had actually increased my wealth while destroying their own lives. An outcome so perfectly ironic that I had to admire the universe's sense of poetic justice. What about the ongoing garnishment of their future earnings? That will continue for the rest of their lives. Every job they get when they're released from prison, every paycheck they earn, will be subject to restitution payments. They'll essentially be working for their victims until the day they die. And their appeals? Denied at every level. The convictions are final. The sentences are being served. And there's no legal mechanism for reducing their obligations to their victims. I hung up and walked through my beautiful home, admiring the way afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that I would never again fear losing. Every room had been restored to perfection. But more than that, every room had been improved beyond what it had been before my temporary exile. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in 6 months. I invited people over, Not a party exactly, but an informal gathering of the friends and allies who had supported me through the darkest period of my life. Margaret Thornton, who had used her social connections to spread awareness of elder abuse issues. Judge Patricia Holloway, who had ensured that justice was served with appropriate severity. Detective Rachel Martinez, whose investigation had exposed the full scope of Sarah and Marcus's crimes. And Diana Foster, whose journalistic coverage had turned my personal tragedy into a public crusade for justice. "Willow," Diana said, as we stood on my restored patio, sipping champagne that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. "I have to ask, was this outcome what you were planning from the beginning?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, did you always know that your patient, methodical response would be more devastating than any immediate retaliation could have been?" I considered the question while watching the sunset make my garden look gold and crimson. The roses were blooming again, their fragrance carrying on the evening breeze like a promise of renewal. "Diana, when Sarah handcuffed me in my own driveway, I had a choice. I could have screamed, fought, demanded immediate justice through whatever channels were available to me. Or I could have smiled, accepted what was happening, and used their assumption of victory against them. So you chose the long game. I chose to teach them a lesson they would never forget, that actions have consequences, that some people fight back, and that underestimating the wrong woman is always a fatal mistake. And now they're in federal prison, facing decades of incarceration and a lifetime of financial servitude to their victims. I'm in my beautiful home, financially secure beyond my previous dreams and surrounded by friends who respect my intelligence rather than dismissing me as a helpless elderly woman. Do you ever feel guilty about the severity of their punishment? I paused, genuinely considering the question. Did I feel guilty about Sarah and Marcus's destruction? Did some part of me regret the thoroughness with which I had dismantled their lives? Diana, do you feel guilty when you expose corrupt politicians? When your investigations lead to prison sentences and ruined careers? No, because those people chose to commit crimes that hurt innocent victims. Exactly. Sarah and Marcus weren't unlucky victims of circumstances beyond their control. They were criminals who systematically exploited vulnerable people for years. The only thing I'm guilty of is ensuring that their victims received justice. Later that evening, after my guests had left, and I was alone in my reclaimed kingdom, I walked through each room slowly, appreciating the silence and the security of knowing that no one could ever again force me from my home. In my study, I opened a new file folder, one that would contain information about other potential cases of elder abuse, other vulnerable seniors who might need an advocate with experience in fighting back against those who would exploit them. Because my victory over Sarah and Marcus was complete, but my mission was just beginning. The phone system I had installed included a dedicated line for what I was calling the Backer Elder Justice Project, a private initiative to identify and combat systematic abuse of senior citizens throughout the state. I already had my first case, an 82-year-old retired teacher whose nephew had convinced her to sign over power of attorney and was systematically taking her money for his own benefit. Some people, I'd learned, never stopped making the same mistakes. They saw elderly people as easy targets, vulnerable victims who could be exploited without consequences. They had no idea that some elderly people had connections, resources, and the kind of patient intelligence that could turn any attack into the attacker's ultimate destruction. My phone rang at exactly 9 p.m. A call I'd been expecting. "Mrs. Backer, this is Correctional Officer Williams at the Federal Correctional Institution. I'm calling because inmate Sarah Chun has requested to speak with you." "I see. And what did you tell her?" "That she would need to follow proper procedures for approved contact lists, but she was quite insistent that I call you personally." "Officer Williams, please inform Miss Chun that she was removed from my approved contact list the day she was sentenced. If she wishes to communicate with me, she can do so through her attorney or through written correspondence that I am free to ignore." "Yes, ma'am. Should I expect any changes to that policy in the future?" "You should expect that policy to remain in effect for the duration of her incarceration. Sarah Chun is no longer my daughter. She's just another convicted criminal who will serve her time and face the consequences of her choices." "Understood, ma'am." I hung up and poured myself a final glass of wine, then walked to my bedroom windows, which offered a view of the neighborhood where I'd lived for 20 years. The houses were lit with warm, welcoming light, their windows glowing like eyes watching over a community where families gathered for dinner. Children played in safe yards, and elderly residents could live with dignity and security. It was exactly the kind of community that people like Sarah and Marcus threatened with their exploitation and abuse. And it was exactly the kind of community that needed people like me to ensure that predators faced appropriate consequences. I raised my glass to the window, toasting not just my own victory, but the promise I was making to every other potential victim in the state. To justice, I said aloud, my voice carrying clearly through the silence of my beautiful home, and to the certainty that some people always fight back. Outside, the neighborhood settled into peaceful evening routines, unaware that their most formidable protector was standing at her bedroom window, planning her next campaign in the war against those who would exploit the vulnerable. Sarah and Marcus had taught me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more patient than I'd ever needed to be, and more dangerous than anyone had ever suspected. Now, I was going to use those lessons to ensure that their story became a cautionary tale that echoed through every conversation about elder abuse, every discussion of family loyalty, and every assumption about what happened when criminals chose the wrong victim. Some women accepted defeat gracefully. Others turned defeat into the foundation for victories that their enemies could never have imagined. I had chosen to be the second kind of woman, and tomorrow I would begin teaching that lesson to the next person foolish enough to underestimate the power of a woman who had learned exactly what she was capable of when properly motivated. The queen had returned to her throne, and her reign would be legendary.